There was a place where the sky leaned down just enough to touch the land, where the edge of the earth no longer seemed entirely grounded. And at that exact point where the final outcropping of stone surrendered its height, to the open air above hung a bell. Not a grand cathedral bell, nor one polished for ceremony or tuned to any particular harmony. It was just a bell, modest in its shape, muted in its color, suspended from a crossbeam so weathered it had splinters older than memory. The path to this place was not marked, not recorded on any map, and perhaps that was why the bell had remained so long undisturbed. Those who came across it never arrived by design. They wandered, often lost in thought or in search of something vague and unnameable. Some claimed they were seeking silence, others, a view, but most never intended to find anything at all. And yet, one by one, in quiet moments stretched between their lives, they reached the stone ledge and saw it, the bell, unmoved by the wind, casting no shadow at certain times of day. It did not ring often. In fact, some said it hadn't rung in years, perhaps decades. The rope beneath it frayed with age, trailing down the stone like a memory that was only half remembered. When the wind passed just right, it brushed against the rope, but never hard enough to move it. It was as if the bell existed not to sound, but merely to be a presence rather than a call. A punctuation mark with no sentence to follow it. A pause placed at the threshold of open sky. Stone and sky had been meeting here long before the bell arrived. The rock had risen from the earth over countless years, shaped by pressures, seasons, and shifts beneath the surface. And the sky had wrapped itself around it gently, patiently, changing hue with time and light, but never pulling away. Their meeting was quiet and constant, and the bell, when it was hung there by hands no longer known, for reasons never explained, did not disrupt the conversation between them. It simply joined. Moss grew thick on the stone, softening the hard edges, giving the ledge a hush of green in spring, a whisper of gold in autumn. Birds came and went, sometimes perching on the beam above the bell, sometimes circling it with a kind of unintentional reverence. But they never nested there. Perhaps they sensed something about the place's stillness not to be disturbed. Even the wind, bold in other parts of the cliff, seemed to hesitate as it passed by the bell. It slowed, coiled around the space, and moved on with less urgency. No one remembered who had hung the bell, or why. There were theories, of course. Some said it was to mark the boundary between heaven and earth, a token of humility hung at the world's edge. Others imagined it had once been rung at dawn to greet the rising sun. Though no structure nearby suggested a monastery or home, a few believed it had never been meant to ring at all, that it was symbolic, silent by design, like a vow kept in secret. One man, years ago, had tried to ring it. He'd come with purpose, boots thick with mud, eyes searching for answers. He grasped the frayed rope, pulled once, and found that the bell gave only the faintest shudder. The sound it made was not a chime, but a sigh deep and hollow, like something exhaling from centuries away. He stepped back, startled, and left before the wind could ask why he'd come. Others did not try to ring it. They sat nearby, on the edge where stone met air, and watched. The bell became part of their silence. It watched with them, not as a guardian or witness, but simply as something present, like the curve of the horizon or the shifting of the clouds. It did not ask anything. It did not offer either. But in its being, it seemed to remind of time, of distance, of the line where things end and something else begins. At dusk, the bell's silhouette stretched long across the stone, growing darker even as the world softened into dusk. The fading light would catch the curve of its surface, highlighting the tarnish, the age, and the way rust had crept across its underside like ivy. And always, it remained still, never tilted, never swayed. Even the thunder could roll above without moving it. There was something sacred in that stillness, not religious, perhaps, but sacred in the way that old things sometimes are, simply because they have endured. The bell had weathered countless winters, had heard storms rage and pass, and had felt the slow erosion of air on metal, stone on rope, and time on memory. It asked nothing of those who came. It had nothing left to prove. The place around it was unremarkable by some measures. No markers, no signs. Just a ledge, a bell, and the wind. But people kept coming. Not many, and never in groups. Always one at a time, and always quietly. Some sat beside it. Some never approached, only looked from a distance. One woman brought a small notebook and wrote for hours without lifting her head. Another left a stone near the bell's base, and it stayed there, untouched, gradually sinking into the moss. They never stayed long. There was a kind of agreement unspoken, perhaps unconscious, that this place was not one to linger in. It was for noticing, for remembering something that didn't need to be explained. The bell had its own way of holding space, and those who arrived came to feel it, not as a burden, but as a recognition that there are places in the world where language ends and presence begins. Sometimes clouds rolled low, and the bell disappeared entirely into mist. You wouldn't even know it was there unless you'd already seen it. On those days, the air was thick with quiet, and even then, even wrapped in fog, the bell remained unmoving, a shape half formed in the gray, a memory waiting to be found again. There were stories, whispers, mostly that those who saw the bell often returned changed. Not dramatically. They did not speak of revelations or visions, but they moved more slowly afterward. They listened more. They paused at thresholds, as if remembering something just beyond the edge of recall. The bell didn't offer answers, but it made people aware of the questions they hadn't known they were asking. Over the years, ivy began to climb the lower half of the beam. A small crack formed at the bell's base, subtle, but widening with the seasons. Still it hung, still it waited, and one day, it would fall. The rope would snap, or the wood would give way, and the bell would drop into the stone beneath it. There would be no sound but the dull, final thud of metal meeting rock. And maybe, in its falling, it would ring at last. Or maybe not. Maybe it would land silently, and that would be fitting, too. But for now, it hung not quietly, as it had for so long, as if it had always been there, even before it was made, as if someone had carved the shape of silence into metal and left it at the edge of the world, to see what would happen. Above it, the sky continued to stretch, sometimes blue, sometimes pale, sometimes storming with a fierce hunger. Below it, the stone held fast, old and unshaken, rising from roots no one could see. And between them, suspended just barely in the balance, hung the bell. It did not move, it did not call, but it remained, and sometimes that was enough. Picture prompt, a lone bell tower silhouetted against a pastel dusk sky. The bell dark with age and framed by the fading light. The town below didn't stir. It lay like a painting unfinished, its edges blurred by the soft breath of morning fog, as if time had paused not out of reluctance, but out of some quiet courtesy. The roofs, layered in centuries of sun and soot, slept on without complaint. Shutters stayed drawn tight over windows like eyelids that hadn't yet decided to open. There were no sounds of wagons rolling, no footsteps echoing on cobblestone, and no laughter slipping out from behind wooden doors. Just stillness. A stillness so complete it seemed to hum with its own kind of energy, a muted pulse that held everything in a suspended moment before life resumed its usual pace. This wasn't a town that had died. It wasn't abandoned or forgotten, though it often felt that way in the earliest hours. It was simply resting, caught between the last breath of night and the first exhale of day. Perhaps that was the difference. Stillness wasn't absence. It was waiting. Waiting so patient and gentle. It asked for nothing and offered nothing except the space to be still. From the hill above, the town looked almost fragile in its silence, as if even the trees leaning at its edges held their leaves a little closer, careful not to rustle too loudly. There was a church steeple that reached quietly into the sky, not in proclamation, but as if it, too, were unsure whether anyone was listening yet. A well sat in the square, its stone slick with dew, its bucket rope motionless and stiff. Even the cats, who usually prowled long before sunrise, seemed to have curled themselves into invisible corners, reluctant to break the spell. It was a silence thick with suggestion. A silence that held stories half told and gestures not yet made. Perhaps someone had left a letter under a door, and the ink was still drying in the hush. Perhaps a child had cried in the night and been gently soothed back to sleep, their dreams still lingering in the corners of the room. The baker's hands may have twitched in his sleep, already remembering the dough not yet kneaded. The mill may have whispered to itself in creaks and sighs. But no grain is turned yet. Nothing had begun, and yet everything waited. In such moments, the town did not seem bound by time. It existed outside the ticking of clocks, as if the very notion of schedules or urgency were suspended. The sun, still hidden behind the low hills, had not yet been given permission to rise fully. It sent only the faintest hints of gold into the highest corners of the sky. The air was cool, but not cold. It held the suggestion of warmth still sleeping within it, ready to rise with the day, but not quite yet. One could walk through that silence and feel as though they were walking not through a place, but through a breath held just a moment longer than usual. There is a strange kind of magic in a town before it wakes. The ordinary becomes sacred. The laundry line, drooping between the tired buildings, holds its cloth espins like silent witnesses to yesterday's breeze. The shop fronts bakers, smiths, cobblers. Forgotten little post offices seem more like props on an empty stage, awaiting actors who haven't yet taken their places. The doors hold secrets from generations past. The alleys don't echo, they absorb. To say the town didn't stir is not to say it lacked life. Quite the opposite. It was full of life, but life in its dormant, contemplative state. The kind of life that listens rather than speaks, that watches rather than moves. The kind of life that prepares itself silently for all the motion to come. In homes where curtains trembled slightly with the breeze from a cracked window, bodies curled beneath quilts made of older fabric than most of their memories. In those brief pre-dawn hours, dreams still held the upper hand, and sleep hadn't yet been replaced by obligations. There were no arguments to resolve, no errands to run, and no words exchanged. Just the subtle weight of breath and warmth of limbs folded softly in the pause. Even the clocks seemed quieter, their ticks dulled, as though reluctant to interrupt. You could almost believe they were unsure of themselves, hesitant to push time forward when everything else refused to follow. If someone were to step outside in those moments on slippered feet or bare toes meeting chilled stone, they would be stepping not into morning, but into a kind of hush that lived just outside of language. The kind of hush that made you hold your breath without knowing why. There were birds, of course, but they, too, waited. They did not burst into song. They chirped sparsely, hesitantly, as if testing the stillness to see if it would break. A single flap of wings could sound louder than thunder if timed wrongly in that fragile silence. Nature itself, often so unapologetic in its rhythm, here chose to slow down and move gently. The trees rustled only slightly. The grass did not yet glisten in the full sun, but shimmered faintly under mist. And the mist, it was everywhere, not heavy enough to obscure, but just enough to soften. It made the town look older, tender, like something remembered rather than seen. Mist has a way of doing that it doesn't hide, but it blurs just enough to make memory feel present. In the fog, everything looked a little less sharp, a little less permanent. Even the chimneys, standing at attention, seemed unsure whether to let out the smoke they were built for. If you listened closely, and you had the patience for it, you could hear the deeper sounds, the ones not made with hands or mouths. The groaning of old wood settling into itself. The distant creak of a sign swaying slightly on its rusted hinge. The faint trickle of water somewhere beneath the street, part of an old aqueduct or a forgotten pipe. The sound of the town breathing, even in its sleep. This was not a moment that could be captured or preserved. You couldn't photograph it, because it wasn't about what was seen. It was about what wasn't seen, what was held in the temporary absence. The town below didn't stir, and in that non-stirring, it offered a strange sort of invitation. Not to wake it, not to disturb it, but to simply observe. To sit beside its stillness and let it seep into your bones. And there's a kind of mourning in that, too, because you know it won't last. You know that in a few minutes or an hour at most, this quiet will be broken. Someone will open a door too loudly. A dog will bark at nothing. A window will slam shut against the wind. Bread will rise, chimneys will puff, and boots will clatter. The town will return to itself, and this moment, this breath of quiet will vanish like steam. But right now, the town doesn't stir, and that's what makes it beautiful. Not because it lasts, but because it doesn't. Because its stillness is a reminder that life isn't always motion. Sometimes it's the pause, the waiting, the breath before the song begins, the stillness between the heartbeats. There are many ways to measure a town, by its population, its buildings, and its history. But there's another kind of measure: how deeply it can be quiet, how thoroughly it can rest. A town that knows how not to stir is a town that remembers. Remembers what it was before the roads were paved and the schedules made, before urgency replaced intention, before sound became proof of purpose. In this moment, as you watch from above, you see not only the town as it is, but also as it once was. And perhaps, in this stillness, even as the world waits to begin again, you sense that this moment is not about absence at all. It is full of potential, of memory, of breath. Full of everything that hasn't happened yet but might. The town below doesn't stir, but that doesn't mean it's asleep. It's simply waiting for a child's first cry, a bell to toll, or a bird to begin the song. And when it does, when the town stirs at last, you will miss the stillness, but you will carry it with you. Because once you have heard a town and its perfect quiet, you begin to hear quiet in all things, even in noise, even in motion, even in yourself. Picture prompt: a silent, nearly abandoned village bathed in the golden pink hue of twilight. Rooftops soft with moss, windows dark. The bell stood in the courtyard of a building that no longer remembered why it had been built. It was neither grand nor plain, its surface worn with age, dulled by time, and softened by countless rains. Moss clung to its base in gentle defiance of the past, and birds, having long since adopted it as their perch of choice, had left quiet white signatures that no one now thought to clean. The bell was not rung anymore. No one had come to ring it in a very long time. In truth, no one even knew if it could still be rung. It had become part of the scenery, more a landmark than an instrument, more a placeholder in memory than an object of meaning. There had once been records, papers, ledgers, inked inscriptions, maybe even a plaque, but those, like so many other things, had been misplaced. Not lost violently or buried in disaster, not torn from history in some dramatic theft, but simply misplaced. That quiet, gentle forgetting that comes not from destruction, but from the soft erosion of interest, the fading of attention, the kind of loss that feels almost polite. The records were likely placed in a drawer that was never opened again, or maybe filed away during some routine cleaning, stored behind something else. And then, just like that, forgotten. The bell was heavy, not only in weight, but also in presence. It seemed to suggest that it had once mattered, not in a loud way, not in a way that begged for significance, but in the way that things do when they have been shaped carefully, placed deliberately, and left with the quiet dignity of purpose. Its shape was purposeful, to the kind of design that once meant something specific. Perhaps it had been used to mark the hour. Perhaps it had been rung at dawn or dusk. Perhaps it had been part of a ceremony, or a signal, or a kind of summoning. Maybe it was rung when someone died, or when someone was born, or when the tide turned. But none of that is known now. The records are gone. And without the records, the bell became a mystery too minor to solve. People still walked by it. Children sometimes touched it as they passed, curious but uncommitted. Tourists once took photos of it, though they could only guess at what it meant. Over time, it stopped being included in the tour guides. Eventually, it was no longer even remarked upon. It was simply part of the place, like a bench no one sat on or a door no one opened. And yet it remained. What's strange is how a thing can lose its explanation and still retain its shape. The bell didn't crumble when forgotten. It didn't vanish once its name was no longer spoken. It simply stayed. In this way, it became a kind of quiet monument not to purpose, but to persistence. It didn't demand memory, didn't beg for attention. It simply endured, and that, in its own subtle way, was profound. There is a certain kind of silence that accompanies objects like this. Not a silence of absence, but of containment. A bell, after all, is built to hold sound, to wait for the moment it's struck so that it can let the sound go. But this bell had not been struck in generations. It had not let go of sound in so long that it began to feel like it might be holding it forever. The silence became something more than quiet. It became history folded in on itself. It became the echo of nothing. When people spoke of the bell at all, they did so with uncertain phrases. I think it used to mean something. I heard it was important once. Maybe it was for storms. No one ever said it with conviction. No one ever said, "This is what the bell was for." They couldn't. The records were gone. What remained was supposition, scraps of oral memory that had frayed too far to be useful. Sometimes, someone would come determined to figure it out. A scholar with a notebook, a local with a theory, a student hoping to write a thesis. They would take measurements, trace markings, and even tap it gently to hear its voice. They would dig through archives, or what's left of them. But in the end, each of them left with more questions than answers. The records had been misplaced so thoroughly, so quietly, that even the questions started to fade. Eventually, no one asked anymore. But the bell didn't mind, or if it did, it gave no sign. Bells, after all, do not ring themselves. They wait, and if the one who would ring them does not come, the bell does not complain. It simply waits longer, and longer still. Time does something strange to purpose. When something no longer serves its intended function, it does not disappear. It becomes something else. Sometimes it becomes decoration, sometimes legend, sometimes furniture. The bell, in this case, became a question to quiet, to ask out loud. A soft punctuation mark at the edge of a forgotten sentence. The building around it changed. Roofs were replaced, paint peeled and was repainted. Windows broke and were repaired. Trees grew taller, casting different shadows on the ground. But the bell remained unchanged. It was too solid to alter easily, too unimportant to move, and too mysterious to discard. There's a kind of humility in that, not being needed anymore, but not resenting it, not protesting your irrelevance, simply continuing to be. It's a stillness that carries a certain wisdom, even if no one notices it. Sometimes, late in the day, when the sun was angled just right, the bell would cast a long shadow across the stones. It looked like a sundial that had forgotten what it was counting. People would walk across its shadow without pausing. But now and then, someone might look down and think, for just a moment, that the shape of the bell's shadow seemed meaningful. That maybe, in another life, another time, the shadow had pointed to something, and then the thought would pass. Like so many others, there's a quiet tragedy in forgetting the purpose of something once so precise. But there's also something oddly comforting about it too. Not everything has to be known. Not everything must be remembered to be real. The bell didn't become less of a bell just because its records were misplaced. It continued to exist. It continued to wait. And in the waiting, it became something new, an artifact not of function, but of patience. Perhaps there is a kind of peace in not being used anymore. I'm no longer being part of the hustle, the noise, or the urgency, in being allowed to be still, to rest without decay, to witness without being called upon. There are many things like the bell in the world, things whose meanings were once clear, but are now murky, things whose names have been rubbed away by time, whose records have been shuffled to the wrong shelf, whose stories have faded beyond repair. Statues in fields, keys with no doors, books with blank dedications, tools whose uses are no longer known, each one holding within it the quiet mystery of something that once mattered might still. In a different way, the bell stands as a reminder that absence of clarity does not mean absence of worth, that usefulness is only one form of value, that the past, even when half forgotten, still breathes through the present in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. And so the bell remains, not because it is needed, not because it is known, but because it is still here, because someone, long ago, gave it shape and sound and reason. And though those reasons are gone, their echo is not. The echo is in the silence, in the way the air moves around the bell, in the way the birds land on it, and in the way the shadow stretches each evening. That echo might not be loud. It might not even be heard, but it is there, just the same. And in the end, maybe that's enough. Picture prompt, a dusty, disorganized archive room with parchment curling at the edges and one shelf leaning as if tired. There was once a bell in a room no one entered, not for weeks, not for years, perhaps not for decades. The door was not locked, and no curse marked the threshold. No grand tragedy had taken place to render the space sacred or sorrowful. It simply was, and in that being, it remained untouched, collecting the thin dust of passing time. The room faced west, and the shutters, slightly askew, let in a sliver of golden light each afternoon, enough to cast long shadows but never enough to stir the dust from its stillness. The bell itself was not ornate. It had no inscription, no crest or date or dedication. Its bronze was dulled with age, mottled with patches of green where the metal had kissed the air too often. It sat on a table with uneven legs, one of which had been wedged with folded paper long ago. That paper curled now at the corners. Its ink faded once held a list of names no longer spoken aloud. Names of people who had once gathered here, perhaps, or names that had once meant something to someone, somewhere. No one came to read it now. And yet, one day, as the wind pushed through the narrow alleyways and whispered under eaves and through cracks in stone walls, the bell rang, just once, a soft, hollow chime neither joyous nor mournful. It was not loud, not startling, but it was heard by no one in particular, and yet, somehow, by the world itself. A sound that existed for its own sake, like a sigh from the throat of the building. It rang, and then it did not ring again. There was no second note, no echo, no call and response. It rang without knowing why. No hand had touched it. No string had tugged it from its rest. It had not been nudged by a curious mouse or jolted by thunder. There was no cause to name it, and yet, there it was, a sound that should not have been and yet had been. Some might say it was the wind. Others, a shift in the table's leg, a settling of the house's bones. But the truth was simpler and stranger. It rang because it could, because some quiet convergence of time and air and pressure align in that invisible geometry only the forgotten places know. It was a note of no consequence and all the weight in the world. The bell did not feel proud or startled or lonely. It had no sense of self, no memory of its own stillness. It had not waited to be wrong. It had simply existed, and now, part of its existence had been marked with sound. That was all. And yet, the sound lingered. Not in the room, for the air was still. Not in the ears of those who had long since stopped listening, but in the place between things, in the space where breath pauses between sentences, in the hollow pause between footsteps on an empty corridor, in the silence that follows the closing of a door you didn't mean to shut so hard. It was not the sound itself that mattered, but the shift it caused in the silence. For in that moment, however brief, the room remembered something. It remembered warmth, perhaps, or laughter, or tension. A moment when someone stood still beside the table, uncertain whether to ring the bell at all. A meeting that never happened. A message never delivered. The potential of sound was never realized until now. It stirred those fragments gently, like fingers brushing the surface of water. Nothing was disrupted. Nothing changed. But the memory shimmered faintly before sinking again beneath the surface. And outside, the world carried on. The sun dipped lower, throwing long slats of light across the floorboards. The shutters shifted slightly, creaking softly. A leaf brushed against the pane before catching the wind and flying on. Somewhere in the town below, a child called out for someone who did not answer, and a dog barked twice in reply. A church bell tolled the hour, louder and more purposeful, unaware of the echo it had mimicked without knowing. But this bell, this small, forgotten one, was not meant to mark the hour. It was not meant to signal arrival or departure or demand attention. It had no schedule, no ritual, and no ceremony. It had been placed there once, in the way people place things they think they might need someday. And then it had been left, as people so often leave things, unfinished and unused, waiting without knowing they're waiting. And so, it rained without knowing why. The dust did not scatter. The paper beneath its leg did not shift. But the table, perhaps, settled slightly, in the old way of things long made to wait. A shift in balance, a minor adjustment, something no one would notice unless they had been watching for a very long time. But no one had, and so the room, too, held its breath. The walls did not reply. The floor did not groan in response. But something in the room seemed a little more aware of itself. Not awake, exactly, just present, aware that it was still a room, still here, still whole in its quietude, that nothing had come to break it down or replace it, that the bell still existed, and that was enough. Years might pass again, or days, or only moments. The bell would not mark them. It did not ring to start a pattern. It had no ambition. But sometimes, when a thing is left alone long enough, it becomes its own kind of listener. And the bell, in its stillness, had learned to listen well. It heard the scratch of ivy growing up the outside wall, the flutter of moths drawn to the last light of dusk, the distant hum of cars in the marketplace below, wheels creaking under old wood. It heard mice whisper to one another in their secret, soft-footed way. It heard rain patter against the roof, and it heard the long silences between storms. It did not answer, until it did. That one note, that single chime. No ceremony, no witness, just presence. In another part of the house, the wallpaper had begun to peel, a slow curling at the edges, revealing the plaster beneath. No one saw it. No one came to press it back down. But if someone had, if they had stepped into the room at that exact moment, they might have felt something different. Not eerie, not magical, just different. As if something had acknowledged their presence before they even arrived. As if the room had recently remembered itself and was still adjusting to the memory. The bell did not glow. It did not move again. Its note had come and gone. And yet, the quiet after was not the same quiet as before. There was a fullness to it, like something had been offered and accepted without question or fanfare. As if an invisible cycle had completed itself not because it had to, but because it could. Because sometimes, a thing rings not to call attention to itself, but simply to be heard by the silence. And the silence, in turn, listens without answering. A breeze passed through the broken shutter slats again. Not enough to move the bell this time, just enough to stir the air. The dust shifted faintly in the light, suspended for a breath before settling again. Outside, the street lamp flickered to life. Inside, the bell waited not with expectation, but with the simple patience of an object that had already done what it was never asked to do. And still, no one came. But that didn't matter, because it rang. It had rung, and that meant the room had changed, even if only by the smallest degree. Even if no one would ever know. It is a strange kind of permanence, the mark left by a sound. You cannot point to it, you cannot touch it, but once it has passed through a space, the space knows. Something aligns differently. Something breathes more slowly, as if waiting has been acknowledged. And so the bell rested again, still dull, still quiet, but never quite the same. And neither was the room. Picture prompt, close up of the bell's surface cracked, rusting, and faintly vibrating in the breeze. There are moments in life quiet, tender, or even disorienting when the expected continuation simply never arrives. Something builds, pauses, seems to anticipate a next step, and then nothing follows. In a story, we call it an unfinished sentence. In music, it is a rest with no return. In memory, it becomes a pause that never fills. Part 5. And then, nothing followed speaks to this kind of ending, the one that doesn't declare itself as such, doesn't announce closure, but simply ceases to continue. To understand this idea deeply, we need to look beyond plot or conclusion and step into the terrain of absence. Nothing followed is not just a lack, it is presence disguised as vacancy. It's what remains when everything expected is faded and no replacement arrives. It is the space after the final word when the reader keeps waiting, eyes still on the page, unsure if they've missed something. This kind of ending feels less like punctuation and more like evaporation. You don't see it happen. Exactly. It's not a slamming door or a last breath. It's just that whatever was happening isn't anymore. The room stays the same. The air still hums faintly, and yet the motion is gone. You find yourself suspended in a moment that doesn't break or resolve but just holds you there. That's what and then. Nothing followed does it wraps you inside a stillness that's both peaceful and a little haunting. This kind of finality is not about death or disaster. It isn't tragedy. It is quieter than that. It's not that everything was destroyed. It's that everything just stopped. The project was never completed. The letter was never sent. The relationship faded instead of ending. The candle burned out, but no one noticed. A routine was disrupted, not with a bang, but by simply not picking it back up the next day. In human terms, this kind of nothing can be the most difficult to process. We are conditioned to look for meaning, art, and consequence. We like stories that end in victory or loss. But when a narrative dissolves without either, we're left in a limbo that the mind tries to fill in but can't. That's where the discomfort often lies. It's not what happened that troubles us, it's that nothing happened after. But in this stillness, there's a strange and subtle kind of truth. Life often doesn't give us resolutions. Friendships drift, projects stall, messages remain unread, promises are forgotten, not broken. There is no dramatic close, only an unanswered silence that grows longer each day until it becomes permanent. The meeting that never occurred, the phone call that was never returned, the thought that never got written down. These are not failures exactly, they are simply what happens when something ends without ceremony. And then, nothing followed also carries the weight of possibility. If nothing follows, what could have? The open-endedness holds a kind of echo, a door still ajar. It suggests that something might have come next had things been different. It's a phrase heavy with ghosts, not of people, but of potential, of what didn't get the chance to exist. A poem unwritten, a reply unsent, a goodbye never spoken. The weight of the unwritten future, never announced and yet softly mourned. There is a particular ache to unfinished things. The absence of conclusion can haunt more than any tragic ending. Closure, however painful, gives shape. It makes a memory feel solid. But when nothing follows, we don't even get that. We're left with a blur, the question mark, and the half-light. It's not even a page torn out, it's a chapter never written. But this is not inherently sad. There is something incredibly human about it. To leave things unfinished is to live in reality. Life doesn't always wrap up. Sometimes the only ending is the silence that comes, when something no longer matters to anyone but you. And that's not a flaw. That's how time works. People move on. Letters go unsent because they're no longer needed. Whole ideas are forgotten because the world kept turning. That is not tragedy, it's just movement. In another sense, nothing followed as a kind of grace. When a story stops not because of crisis, but because it simply has no more to give, it allows the reader, the viewer, and the participant to rest. You are no longer carried forward by momentum. There is no cliffhanger. There is no next. You're simply left with what was. And while that can feel empty at first, it can also be comforting. A reminder that it's okay not to keep going forever. That some things exist for a while and then do not. In that stillness, we're asked not to push but to receive. Not to invent a next step, but to sit in the one we were left with. A kind of invitation to presence. Because when nothing follows, it means that what came before now carries all the meaning. It is what remains. And so we return to it again, not to change it, but to understand that it is now whole, because it is all there is. Sometimes we imagine an ending as something grand, a curtain dropping, music swelling, or a final monologue. But there is another kind of ending that simply leaves the door open and then never comes back through it. The last light turns off, not in protest, but in quiet agreement. The story doesn't say the end. It just stops telling. This is how memory often works. 2. We don't always remember the final moment someone left. Sometimes we just realize one day that we haven't seen them in years. And there's no specific point where the connection ended, it just loosened until it drifted away. No conflict, no climax. Just life, quietly redirecting itself. In creative work, this phenomenon can feel particularly poignant. A journal entry without a final date, a manuscript with a blank final page, a melody that lingers, never resolving its last chord. These aren't failures. They are pauses that became permanent. Intentional or not, they speak to the way creation is tied to impermanence. That not every story needs to finish. Some simply needed to exist as far as they did, and no further. Even in relationships, this kind of ending without declaration can be the most painful to name. We like clear breakups, defined departures, and scheduled goodbyes. But many of the relationships in our lives end in the way of this phrase. They simply don't show up one day. The call doesn't come. The conversation fades. And at some point, you realize, and then, nothing followed. Yet within that realization, we're offered something else. A kind of stillness that allows for reflection instead of reaction. When the end isn't announced, you're left alone with the pieces, and in that solitude, you can notice what they meant to you without distraction. The lack of a final chapter doesn't mean the story was meaningless. If anything, it allows you to carry the story forward in your own way, because no one else came to close the book for you. Sometimes, silence is the final word, and not because there was nothing more to say, but because silence said it best. This phrase also challenges the way we think about progress and productivity. We live in a world that expects continuance, constant forward motion. And then, nothing followed asks us to pause and consider the value of things left open, not as failures, but as expressions of a truth we rarely say aloud. Not everything finishes. Not everything must. There is dignity in the fragment, beauty in the pause that never resolves. If you imagine this as a story, part 1 might be the beginning, part to the development, part 3 the conflict, and part for the change. Then we arrive at part 5 and expect resolution. But instead, the only line is, and then, nothing followed. It is both the most honest and the most jarring choice. Because life is like that. Sometimes part 5 is just a blank wall, and you sit with it until it becomes your reflection. So what do we do with this kind of ending? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps we don't do anything with it at all. We just acknowledge it, accept it, let it be. Because maybe that's what it's asking of us, not interpretation, not continuation, but recognition. That something ended softly, silently, without need for spectacle. And that is enough. In some way, this is what peace looks like, not a happy conclusion, but a quiet one. Not a ribbon on top, but simply the act of placing the final stone and walking away. You don't know if someone else will come by. You don't know if it will be remembered. But for now, you know you are done. And so, we end here, not because we ran out of words, but because the words have led us as far as they could. The rest is not silence in the dramatic sense. It is just space. The quiet space where the story lived, and where it now rests. Picture prompt, a wide shot of the tower after the ringing, now still again under a deepening sky. Dusk was always the time of almosts. It was not day, not yet night, but some quiet and in-between place that never lasted long enough to be claimed. Light was not gone, but it no longer belonged entirely to the sky. Shadows did not fall, they rose, stretching gently across walls, paths, and faces, as if reminding the world of its edges. It was a time when windows glowed from within, but no lamps had yet been lit. A time when the birds quieted just enough to let silence step in, but not so fully that you could call it stillness. There was movement, but soft. There were colors, but fading. Everything was retreating just slightly, not with regret, but with the quiet dignity of something knowing it had done enough for the day. People often misunderstood dusk. They thought of it as the beginning of an end, but really, it was the softest rival, a hush that never tried to declare itself. You could miss it if you blinked too slowly, or walked too quickly, or looked only at things with names. But if you paused just for a moment, you could feel it settle. Not heavily, but like a shawl pulled lightly across the shoulders. It asked nothing of you. It offered nothing concrete in return. But there was something in its ambiguity that made the world seem briefly suspended, as though the day were taking a final breath before letting go. At dusk, the world spoke more in suggestion than in certainty. Paths seemed to curve more gently. The rustle of leaves carried questions rather than answers. Things not said during the day pressed quietly at the edge of awareness, not loud enough to disturb, but present enough to feel. The air itself held a kind of waiting, not urgent, but watchful. And there, in that waiting, was where the almosts lived. It was the time of almost arrivals, the sound of footsteps that might belong to someone you had forgotten you were waiting for. The clink of a cup that seemed just shy of a conversation. The way the light turned everything gold for a breathless instant before it disappeared into blue. Doors half open, sentences half finished. A breeze that made you pause without knowing why. Almost lived in the glance someone didn't quite give. In the memory that rose halfway and then dissolved. In the feeling that something should be said, but the moment to say it had already passed, or perhaps not yet come. Dusk didn't mind. It held them all gently, with neither judgment nor urgency. There was no need to resolve anything here. The world, in this moment, did not require clarity. The streets at dusk were quieter, but not empty. Someone might still be out, walking home, their coat buttoned but loose, as if they'd forgotten whether they were cold. The lights in the shop windows flickered softly, some being turned off one by one, others left glowing for reasons no longer practical. The bakery would be sweeping its last crumbs. A cafe might have one lone figure sitting near the glass, a cup in hand, not drinking, just holding, watching, not waiting, not for anything in particular, just because it felt like the thing to do. Children, if still outside, moved slower at dusk, not because they were tired, but because some part of them, perhaps unknowingly, understood that the day was slipping and didn't want to startle it. Their laughter softened. Their games grew less structured. Chalk drawings became pale, and jump ropes slowed to swings. Even the shouts that had pierced the afternoon seemed to bend toward whispers. The day had been noisy enough. Now it wanted gentleness. Dusk was also the time of almost memories. The kind that rose when you passed a doorway you hadn't noticed in years, or when a scent drifted across your path that reminded you of something not quite nameable. It was the time when old songs seemed to hum at the edge of hearing, and when you might suddenly recall the shape of a room you'd once sat in, or the way someone once said your name. The memories didn't ask to be examined. They just brushed against you, lightly, like a moth in low light, uncertain of its direction. Sometimes, someone would light a candle not because it was needed, but because it felt right. The flame, small and steady, echoed the fading sky. Its glow didn't replace the sun, but acknowledged its leaving. In that gesture, there was no sadness, only acceptance. The light was different now, and that was all right. Things changed, not always suddenly, sometimes slowly, gently, like dusk itself, almost without notice. Inside homes, dusk settled differently. It crept along the edges of curtains, curled into the corners of rooms, softened the angles of furniture. Voices grew quieter here, too. Even the ticking of clocks seemed slower. There was a kind of permission in this hour not to finish, not to begin, but simply to pause. You didn't need to accomplish anything at dusk. You didn't need to understand it. You only needed to let it pass through you. Letters often remained unwritten at this hour, not because the words weren't there, but because dusk made them feel like they didn't need to be said just yet. Decisions, too, were postponed, not avoided, just given more space. Dusk was good at space. It was wide and patient and kind to hesitation. It understood that sometimes things must linger in their unfinishedness. There were days when dusk lingered longer than expected, as if reluctant to move on. The sky would stretch out its in-between pallid violet and amber, lavender and deep gray, and the transition felt unhurried. It wasn't holding on, exactly, just making sure the change was gentle. And sometimes, that was needed. The world didn't always need to rush into night. Sometimes it needed to ease into it softly, with a little grace. Even animals responded differently at dusk. Birds nested with less flutter. Cats moved more slowly, tails flicking like punctuation to sentences not spoken. Dogs rested their heads on folded paws, their gaze half alert, half dreaming. The world didn't stop, it merely slowed. It exhaled. It softened around the edges. Those who found themselves walking during this time often felt a kind of quiet in their chest. Not emptiness, not sadness, just a soft presence, as though the sky, in fading, had made more room for something else to be felt. A presence that didn't press but simply existed, and sometimes that was enough. Poets had written about dusk, of course, but never quite captured it. They came close, describing colors and moods, comparing it to endings and beginnings, to memories and longings. But dusk itself never insisted on metaphor. It didn't require explanation. It was content to be what it was, a moment between. Almost, or what made dusk holy, if such a word could apply to something so subtle. Holy not in ritual or rule, but in breath, in silence, in pause. A holiness made of softness, of nearlies, of the grace and not quites. The world at dusk didn't strive. It accepted. You could sit at your window at dusk and see stories forming that would never be told. A woman opening her mailbox, then pausing with a letter unopened in her hand. A man tying his shoes, then sitting back on his step, not leaving just yet. A teenager standing under a streetlight, phone forgotten in their palm, staring at something unseen in the distance. All almosts, all moments caught in the weave between action and stillness. And when the light faded fully, and dusk gave itself over to night, it never did so abruptly. It disappeared gently, as if stepping backward into the dark. There was no bang, no declaration, just absence. And even that absence felt soft, like a blanket being drawn across the day. They almost folded themselves quietly into dreams or silence or things left undone. And that, too, was okay. Because dusk never promised conclusion. It promised possibility. It was not the end of the day, it was the deep breath before the dream. It was the margin in which you could place all your uncertainties and have them held without judgment. It was the sigh at the edge of sleep, the kindness in unfinished thoughts, the soft light that asks nothing but to be noticed. And so, dusk remained just long enough to remind the world that it didn't always have to be certain to be beautiful. That almost were a kind of truth, too, and that sometimes the gentlest parts of life live in the moments we never quite reach, but feel all the same. Picture prompt, an empty bench facing the horizon, where light is slipping away caught between gold and gray. No one set a candle in the window anymore. Once, this was a gesture as ordinary as drawing breath, done without thought yet filled with meaning. It was a habit passed quietly from hand to hand, across generations who never questioned the impulse behind it. You lit the candle when someone was expected door, even if they weren't but might be. You placed it in the window where its small flicker could be seen from the road, from the fields, from wherever someone might return late, uncertain, and in need of a sign that the house still waited for them. It was less about light and more about presence. The candle didn't need to illuminate the path, just show that there was one. But now, no one sets a candle in the window anymore. The windows remain bare and dark at night, blind-eyed and impenetrable. The glass reflected nothing but the blackness outside, and the occasional wandering shadow from within. The ledges gathered dust, smooth and undisturbed. If there were candles, they stayed in drawers, their wax untouched and their wicks stiff with disuse. The act, once instinctual, had faded not with ceremony, but with indifference, forgotten not because it stopped mattering, but because no one remembered how to say that it mattered. In the town's quieter homes, especially the ones on the outer edges, where the fields began to stretch out into the distance, the absence of the candle was almost palpable. There were those who still remembered it, faintly, like a melody they used to hum but no longer had the notes for. They might glance at the window in the early dusk and feel something missing. They might pass by the drawer where the old matchbox still sat and pause for a second longer. then they meant to. But they would not strike the match. They would not light the wick. They would think of it and then continue, as if the thought were nothing more than a ghost brushing past their shoulder. The world had changed, or maybe just the pace of it. Where once there was waiting, there was now assumption. Where there had been patience, now came distraction. People didn't look for the candleless light because they didn't expect anyone to be waiting. Phones buzzed, cars hummed, and doors locked with a beep. And everyone assumed that arrival was always a certainty and welcome was implied, not displayed. A porch light might flicker on automatically, triggered by motion. But it wasn't the same. A sensor didn't say, "I stayed up for you." A bulb didn't whisper, "I thought of you the whole time you were gone." The candle had a softness to it. Its light was a question without demand. "Are you coming home tonight? And if you are, here I am." Its glow didn't chase away the darkness, only reminded it that someone still chose to hope within it. It was a fragile defiance, a trembling flame in a window that refused to stop believing that someone might still be walking back along the old road, cold and late and grateful to see that flicker from afar. Now the windows were dark, but it was more than that. They were closed. Drawn curtains, slatted blinds, glass smudged with time. The town had retreated inward, not out of grief, necessarily, or despair. More out of habit, out of the way. Small things fall away when no one is watching. A missing note in a song, a phrase in a language no one speaks anymore. The candle was just one such thing. But to walk the streets at night and not see any candles lit, that was a kind of quiet that felt deeper than silence. The kind of quiet that settled not in the ears but in the chest. It made the houses feel less like homes and more like boxes. Safe, yes, efficient, but hollowed out just slightly at the edges, like a story missing its ending. Once, the candles had meant safety. A traveler lost in a snowstorm might catch sight of one in the distance and find their steps quickening with relief. A child running home late from a neighboring field might scan the horizon for the golden dot that meant they hadn't been forgotten. Even in sorrow, the candle had its place. It was lit when someone left and again when someone didn't return. Not because it would bring them back, but because it marked the space they had left behind. In that way, the candle was more than light. It was memory made visible, a promise without words, a pause between absence and return. Now, there were other lights, brighter ones, street lamps that hummed, television screens that glowed behind curtains, phones that glared in pockets, but none of them were meant for the person who wasn't yet home. They were meant for the people already there, for the ones who had stopped expecting someone else to arrive. You could stand on the road just beyond the town, where the hills dipped low and the trees parted, and look back at the row of houses. Once, that view would be dotted with points of flickering gold. Now, it looked like a shadowed silhouette, still beautiful, but distant, impersonal, complete in itself, as if nothing outside its walls mattered anymore. There are those who still remember lighting them. An older woman might recall the ritual, her fingers remembering the curve of the matchstick, the way the flame caught the wick, and the moment the wax began to soften. She might remember standing there in the window, her breath making faint clouds on the cold glass, and thinking not just of someone far away but of the waiting itself. How sacred the waiting had felt. How generous. She might remember the feeling of being needed for the reason to be the one who held the light. And perhaps she sometimes wants to do it again. But then she sees the street outside. Quiet, yes, but not expectant. Not the way it used to be. No footsteps. No wheels on gravel. No silhouettes approaching from the trees. Just the steady, ever-spreading hum of a world that believes everything can be known ahead of time. Scheduled, texted, and estimated by GPS. Why light a candle for someone whose arrival time is already calculated to the minute? Why hope aloud when no one else is listening for hope in the dark? But maybe that's the point. Maybe the candle wasn't ever about usefulness. Maybe it was an act of faith. Not in someone's punctuality, but in their worth. It said, "You matter enough for me to make space for you, just in case." It said, "I believe in your return, even when I don't know when or how or why. No one sets a candle in the window anymore, but perhaps that's why it should be done again. Not because someone is expected, but because someone is welcome. Because not all arrivals are scheduled. Not all returns are loud. Sometimes people come back quietly, hesitantly, needing reassurance that the door will still open, that the home still remembers them. And the candle could be that reassurance, a small thing, a fragile flame, a gesture easily missed, but also a beacon, a reminder that someone, somewhere, still believes in waiting, still believes in welcome, still believes that light belongs in dark places, not to chase the dark away, but to remind it that it's not alone. It doesn't take much. A stub of wax, a window ledge, a match. It's true that no one sets a candle in the window anymore, but perhaps, one day, someone will. Without explanation, without an audience, without knowing if anyone will see it, just because something in them remembers or hopes. And on that night, the town might look different again, just a little. A single flicker in one house, then another, and slowly, the town becomes threaded with light again, not bright, not brash, but quiet and deliberate. A constellation across rooftops, a kind of language between homes, a whisper of return, and maybe, on that night, someone walking up the road will see that flicker and stop. Maybe their shoulders will loosen. Maybe their steps will quicken. Not because they see the destination, but because they see the invitation. Maybe that's all a candle ever was. A question. A welcome. A quiet saying of here I am. I remembered you. Comin'. Picture prompt. A window with dust on the sill. No candle. Just faint smudges where something once stood. There are moments when the world shifts, not with drama or thunder, but with such softness that the change almost goes unnoticed. One such moment belonged to a particular sky. It wasn't remarkable at first glance, not blazing with sunset, not heavy with storm, not even particularly clear. It simply existed. And yet, as the hours stretched quietly onward, something began to change within it. Something subtle, something not easily described. The sky faded, not into darkness nor into light, but into a color that refused to name itself. It wasn't blue anymore, not the eager blue of morning or the endless blue of noon. But it wasn't purple either, nor gold, nor the pale wash of silver twilight. It was, instead, a color caught between things. A tone that lived in the seam between what was ending and what had not yet begun. And in its quiet transformation, it asked for nothing. It didn't demand that anyone look up. It didn't beckon the poets or the painters. It simply faded slowly, carefully into a hue that language could not hold. Below that sky, the world was quiet, not still. Entirely there were the small movements of ordinary life, the turning of keys in doors, the faint shuffle of someone closing their shutters, the low, sleepy murmur of doves in the eaves. But these things, too, moved within the quiet. They didn't disturb it, they fit into it, as though the whole world had agreed, for just a while, to exist gently, to whisper instead of shout, to pause instead of push. And overhead, the sky kept fading, not as an act of decay, but of soft transformation. The kind of change that doesn't erase what came before, but folds it inward, absorbs it, like fabric gathering into shadow, like ink dispersing in water. A slow letting go of what once was clear, dissolving into something not meant to be defined. Perhaps this was why no one remembered that sky. Not exactly. They remembered the day vaguely, the errands they ran, the meals they made, and the letters they forgot to send. They remember that they were tired, or thoughtful, or unusually quiet. They might have looked up once and squinted, thinking the sky seemed odd today. But the moment passed before the thought finished forming, and so it became one of those days that leaves no sharp edge to recall. A day that nestled into memory like dust into a windowsill present, but unnoticed. But the sky remembered. The sky had faded, not because it wanted attention, but because it had to. Because it was time. Because there are colors the world must pass through, even if no one names them, even if no one sees. And this color, this unnamed color, was not alone. There is a moment just before the stars appear, when the sky holds its breath, when it has not yet committed to night, but no longer belongs to day. In that breathless pause, this color lives. It is the color of things left unsaid, the color of glances exchanged but not explained, the color of waiting rooms and empty train platforms, the color of silence when someone almost says something important but doesn't. It is not melancholy. It is not joyful. It is not even neutral. It is something else entirely. The color of in between. And so the sky, on that particular day, faded into the rare, unnamed tone. The trees below did not stir. The wind had calmed into stillness, and even the birds had quieted, as though they, too, recognized the delicacy of this passage. The world often applauds the sunrise, mourns the sunset, and fears the storm. But few understand the quiet miracle of a sky slipping silently out of itself, becoming something unknown for a brief, impossible moment. In old journals, weather was sometimes noted in the margins. Rainy, clear, overcast, chill breeze. But no one ever wrote, the sky was a color I didn't recognize. Perhaps they didn't know how to say it, or perhaps they thought it was unimportant. But on this day, that is what the margin would have said had anyone thought to write it down. Somewhere, a candle was being lit, not in reverence or ceremony, but simply because the light had changed and someone's eyes could no longer read. The soft hiss of the match, the faint flicker of flame, small gestures in response to something larger, unnoticed. For every moment the sky changes, something else must shift to meet it. A curtain drawn, a lamp turned on, a coat put on a little early, just in case. But the sky did not mind going unmarked. It had done this before, 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times. It had become this color over forgotten cities, over quiet forests, and over the backs of wandering ships. It had faded into this hue while children slept and dogs turned circles in their nests of blanket. It had become this color behind locked windows and hospital beds and lonely park benches. Always unnoticed, always brief, always beautiful. And yet, no one ever said, the sky was a color again, the one we don't have a word for. Because we do not name what we cannot hold. And the color that moment was not meant to be held, only witnessed, or not witnessed. It did not matter. And that fading, something else was happening. Too, a kind of soft permission was being granted to rest, to reflect, to release, to let the day slip away without resolution. Not every story needs its ending spoken aloud. Not every question needs an answer before the dark arrives. And the sky, in its gentle transformation, gave its quiet blessing to all unfinished things. There were windows in that town that faced the sky, but the people behind them were busy washing dishes, braiding hair, and folding shirts. They didn't look up. They didn't need to. The sky was not performing. It was simply being. And in its being, it taught something old and easily forgotten, that beauty is not always loud. That meaning can exist without recognition. That change can happen without names. And still, it faded. The unnamed color deepened, then thinned, shifted, then passed. Not sharply, not suddenly, just as it had come softly. The stars, shy at first, began to blink into view. Not many, just enough. The color receded, not into blackness, not into void, but into transparency, into the quiet canvas of night. The color was gone, and yet not gone. It had become part of the dark, folded into the silence of the hours to come. No one spoke of it the next day. No one remembered. But the sky had done what it needed to do. And somewhere perhaps within the folds of a dream, or in the pause between two waking thoughts, someone would carry the memory of the color without knowing it. A feeling, a hush, a tone without definition. A softness pressed gently into the corner of their memory. Like a page turned without reading but somehow understood. That is how some things stay. Not by being remembered, but by never truly leaving. And so the sky faded once, long ago, into a color without a name. And the world, without asking why, simply let it. Picture prompt, the sky turning the color between lavender and slate, clouds becoming indistinct. There is a kind of quiet that doesn't resist time, doesn't rush it, doesn't mark it with great change or transformation, it simply coexists with it. And still, the our past is a statement so simple, so undramatic, that it feels like it could be overlooked. And yet, it is in this very quietness that something profound reveals itself. It does not say that something happened. It does not promise a climax. It does not even insist that anything changed, only that the hour passed. And that, in itself, is everything. Time doesn't require us to participate to move. It doesn't ask for drama or acknowledgement. It doesn't wait for understanding or insist on progress. Time moves regardless, whether we are joyful or grieving, occupied or bored, attentive or lost in thought. Still, the hour passes. And there is something deeply grounding about that truth. In a world obsessed with productivity, momentum, and action, the idea that time can move without us is both humbling and oddly comforting. This phrase does not frame the hour as victorious or wasted. It doesn't say whether it was meaningful, painful, blissful, or numb. It only confirms that it occurred, that it arrived, stayed, and then moved on. It is a recognition, not an evaluation. A moment was allowed to be what it was, without pressure to be anything more. In this way, and still, the hour pass becomes a kind of permission. A permission to let the hour pass even if you did nothing remarkable within it. Even if you were quiet. Even if you were uncertain. Even if all you did was breathe. Even if you sat in a room and stared at nothing. Time passed, and you didn't have to earn that passage with accomplishment or clarity. There's an invisible power in simply existing through time. Often, we mark our days by what we achieve or how we fill them. But the truth is, most of our lives unfold not in milestones, but in the simple act of continuing, of enduring an hour that doesn't ask anything from us, but stays anyway. The kind of hour you only notice in retrospect when you realize you're still here. You may not remember exactly what you did during the time, but you were present for it. That matters. In times of grief or exhaustion, this phrase takes on even more weight. There are moments when life feels too heavy to move forward, when even getting through a single hour seems impossible. And yet somehow you do. The hour passes. You may not feel stronger. You may not feel changed. But time, like breath, continues quietly, steadily, without needing to be witnessed or celebrated. There is dignity in that, in simply being, and being alive through a moment, no matter what that moment contained. Sometimes, survival itself is the action. The hour doesn't care whether you cried, whether you laughed, whether you spoke or stayed silent. It just moved forward, carrying you with it, gently and without condition. There's a reason clocks tick regardless of whether anyone watches them. The passage of time is not contingent upon acknowledgement. It doesn't speed up when you ray busy or slow down when you beg it to. It just moves. And in that inevitability, we find something strangely reassuring. That time moves even when we're unsure how to. And still, the hour past also speaks to emotional resilience. It's the hour after an argument when you don't know what to say. The hour after bad news, when nothing makes sense. The hour you spend lying on the floor because everything feels too heavy. The hour you stare out the window, not thinking of anything at all. These are not dramatic hours. They are not productive. They are not romanticized. But they are real. They pass, despite everything. And then there are the hours that feel suspended in beauty. A sunset you didn't know would take your breath away. The quiet hush of a room lit only by candlelight. The stillness of holding someone's hand without speaking. These are the moments you want to pause. But still the hour passes, no matter how golden or how soft. It cannot remain. And that, too, is part of its beauty. The fleetingness is what makes it precious. This phrase can be read as a gentle acceptance of impermanence. It doesn't rage against the ticking of the clock. It doesn't glorify stillness or movement. It simply observes. Time went on, even without resolution, even without a narrative arc, even if you felt frozen in place. Time was not. It carried you, whether you noticed or not. Sometimes, we think the world is waiting for us to catch up. That if we don't move, the day won't begin. But the truth is, The hour does not need our permission to unfold, and that can be freeing. You are allowed to be still. You are allowed to not know. The hour will pass whether you race through it or rest within it. Time is not a judge. It is a companion. Think of the kinds of hours this could describe. The hour in which you waited for someone who never came. The hour you spent in a hospital corridor, not knowing what news would come. The hour after the guests left and the house fell into silence again. The hour you sat by your sleeping child, marveling at the miracle of their breath. The hour you read the same page over and over, too tired to comprehend the words. The hour you watched shadows lengthen on the wall, tracing time through light. In each of these, the world turned. The sun moved just slightly across the sky. The minute hand shifted one tick at a time. Maybe you didn't notice. Maybe you did. But the hour passed just the same. What's profound is how small this sounds and yet how much it holds. It's not a grand declaration. It's barely even a sentence. But it carries the quiet truth that life is mostly made up of ordinary hours. Hours we survive. Hours we forget. Hours that gently slip past while we are busy trying to name our feelings. Hours that don't ask for anything more than our presence. And still, the hour past also invites us to reflect on how we inhabit time. So much of our lives are measured, deadlines, schedules, and goals. But this phrase asks nothing of us, except acknowledgement, not, what did you do with the hour? Just, did you notice it passed? That shift from pressure to presence is subtle, but powerful. In this way, the phrase is also meditative. It becomes a mantra of sorts, a reminder that whatever you're going through, time will pass, and not in a dismissive you'll get over it way, but in a tender, trustworthy way. Even when you don't feel like moving, time does. Even when you are still, your story continues. Not always in bold strokes, sometimes just in breath. The word still is crucial here. It means despite everything, despite confusion, despite silence, despite stagnation, despite resistance. It means even so, even with the wait, even with the pause, time moved forward. Sometimes this brings comfort, other times, melancholy. There are hours we want to hold on to, stretch out forever, and yet, they pass, even the best ones, especially the best ones. But to know that we were there for them, that we lived through that hour is something, maybe everything. This is the hour no one remembers in stories, but everyone lives through in real life. The in-between, the quiet, the waiting, the healing, the breathing, the being. These are not nothing hours. These are the hours that hold us together. And still, the hour past could be inscribed on any ordinary day, on a Tuesday afternoon with no appointments, on a Sunday evening before the week begins, on the minute before a decision, in the moment after a realization. It is not an hour that announces itself. It is the kind that simply stays with you, gentle, barely there, but undeniably part of you now. When we look back on our lives, we might be surprised by how many of our most formative moments were not dramatic peaks, but quiet hours like this one. Hours that passed while we were becoming ourselves without knowing it. Hours that healed us in ways we couldn't articulate. Hours that were simply lived. So if you find yourself in such a moment in a room where nothing much is happening, in a feeling you can't quite name, in a pause that feels like it might stretch forever, remember this. And still, the hour passed. You are inside the current of time, even when you feel still. The river moves even when you don't paddle. You are not lost. You are simply inside a moment that is taking its time. And when it's over, you won't always know what changed. You won't always feel different. But time will have moved. The hour will have passed. And so will you with it, through it. Beyond it, there may be no conclusion to draw, no revelation, no answer. Just this. The world kept turning. The light shifted slightly. Your breath continued, and still, the hour passed. Picture prompt, the clock facing the tower, hands stuck between numbers. But the world dimming anyway. Its door swung with the wind. Not loudly, not with a slam or creak that would make you turn your head, but softly, rhythmically, like something long accustomed to moving without resistance. It moved as if it remembered, how to be open, but had long since stopped waiting for anyone to come through. A wooden door, weathered by time and the elements, suspended from rust-streaked hinges that held on not by force, but by habit. The house it belonged to had long ago settled into the earth, not fallen, not abandoned in ruin, but settled gently, as if conceding to time rather than fighting it. Its walls leaned slightly, not from carelessness but from age. Its windows, once bright eyes facing the world, now wore a film of dust and forgotten seasons. Yet the door remained intact, and it moved as it always had, forward and back, inhale and exhale, invitation and release. There was no path leading to it anymore. Grass had grown where feet once trod, and wildflowers curled close to the foundation, as if trying to listen to the silence inside. The wind seemed to know the way, though. It found the door every day, brushing against it like a familiar visitor. It would coax it gently, and the door would move, never opening fully, never closing completely, just swinging, slowly, in the same arc it had known for years. No one could say exactly when the last person passed through the doorway. It had been a long time, but the house did not complain of being left alone. It held its emptiness with grace, as if it had learned to appreciate the quiet that followed the years of voices and footsteps, of laughter and disagreement, of comings and goings. Now it was still, and the door was the only thing that moved. It was enough. The wind treated the door with care. It never pushed too hard. It understood, somehow, the age of the wood, the looseness of the latch, the softened grain where hands had once pressed and pulled and knocked. There were fingerprints still, if you looked close enough, oils long since dried into the surface, smoothed by repetition and habit. This was not the door of a place forgotten, but of one remembered quietly, like an old name you do not speak aloud but carry in your mind all the same. Each time the door swung, the house breathed just a little. You could feel it if you stood nearby, that subtle shift of air, cool, dry, scented with old wood and dust and something else. Not decay, but memory, the kind that lives in corners and lingers long after people leave. The air inside the house was slow, thick with stories that no longer needed telling. They had already been lived, and that was enough. Sometimes the wind would catch the door in just the right way, and it would swing a bit farther than usual, letting a sliver of the interior show. A glimpse of a room where light barely touched the floor, where a chair sat forever turned slightly from the table, where a teacup rested on a windowsill, rim chipped, dust gathered in the curve. Nothing had moved in years, and yet nothing had collapsed either. The house was not broken. It had simply paused. No footsteps were leading away from the house. No sign of departure. No luggage taken. No door closed with finality. It was as though the last person who left had done so only briefly, and had simply forgotten to return. The house never held this against them. It waited the way old places do, not with expectation, but with patience, with the understanding that not all returns are physical. Some are memory, some are the wind. Children who wandered too far from the main road would sometimes find the house. They would peer through the shifting door, eyes wide, breath caught in the softness of early evening. They dare each other to step closer, then retreat, half laughing, half wondering. They never stayed long. The house did not scare them. It simply made them quiet. The kind of quiet they didn't yet understand, but would remember later, perhaps in a dream or a moment of stillness when they were older. Birds made their homes in the eaves, small nests tucked into the curve where the roof met the wall. They came and went, unbothered by the slow swing of the door below. In winter, snow would build against the threshold, muffling the movement. In summer, vines crept closer, sometimes brushing the door as if trying to speak its language. But the door said nothing. It only moved. On stormy nights, when the wind grew stronger, the door held its rhythm. It did not bang or break. It simply adjusted, finding a new pace, a different angle. It had done this before, many times, long before anyone could remember. The hinges groaned, but not in protest, just in conversation, as if speaking back to the wind in its way. They understood each other, this door and wind. They had shared countless evenings, There was something deeply comforting in that motion. That it kept going, that even after the people had gone, the door continued to move, acknowledging the world, answering the breeze, keeping the breath of the house alive. It was a ritual with no audience, no clear purpose, and yet it continued forward, back, forward, back. Always softly, always just enough. Sometimes someone would pass by and stop, not because they were lost, but because something in them recognized the sound. The gentle knock of the door, the soft rustle of grass. It stirred a memory they couldn't quite place. A childhood home, a summer cabin, or perhaps a house that had only existed in a dream. They pause, stand still, listen to the rhythm, and then walk on. They never touched the door. That felt like it would break something. If you stood close enough, in the hush between gusts, you could almost hear the house breathe. Not literally, of course, but something like it. The way the boards settled, the sigh of the rafters, the small shifting of dust from the shelf to the floor. A kind of exhale that never fully stopped. The door was its mouthpiece, swinging not in need, but in memory, in continuation. Once, long ago, someone had painted the door. Faint traces of blue still lingered beneath the gray. Not a bold blue, but a soft, one sky-colored, delicate, almost watery. The kind of color that fades quickly in sunlight but never completely disappears. It had peeled in places, curled at the corners like old paper, but you could tell it had once been lovely. Someone had chosen it carefully, not to impress, but to welcome. Inside, the walls still held faint outlines where pictures had once hung. Frames long removed, but their shadows remained. Dust had traced around them, preserving the shape. It was almost more honest this way, memories that stayed not because they were kept, but because they were allowed to settle. The door, opening only slightly, sometimes let just enough light in to reveal those shapes, as if the house were remembering, too. And though no one came through anymore, the door did not resent its solitude. It did not stiffen or close itself in protest. It remained open just barely, just enough. Its swing was not desperate. It was gentle, rhythmic, resigned, perhaps, but not sad. There was a peace in its motion, a kind of ritual in continuing to move when no one was watching, when no one asked it to. It had been part of a life once. Many lives, perhaps. People had stood in that doorway to say goodbye, to greet a guest, to call the children in for supper, to watch the sky turn orange in the evening. And now it moved with only the wind. But somehow, that didn't feel like a loss. It felt like a quiet inheritance, a memory held in motion. The wind would come again tomorrow. The door would move again, as it always had. Not for a reason, not for an audience, but because that's what it did. And in that motion, the house remained alive in its way. Not lively, perhaps, but aware, present, and at peace. And so the door swung, forward and back, no louder than a thought, no faster than a breath. With the wind, always with the wind. Inside, the steps were worn to a dip. They didn't creak dramatically, nor cry out beneath weight. They merely yielded a subtle surrender shaped by repetition. Smooth not by intention, but by years of silent passage to someone unfamiliar. They might go unnoticed, just a slight curve in the wooden grain, a soft shallowing where the foot naturally falls. But to those who had lived in or passed through the place again and again, the dip in the step was as intimate as breath, proof of presence, of rhythm, of people who once climbed without thinking and descended without pause. The wear wasn't damaged. It was memory made physical. The wood didn't chip. It remembered. Every morning stride, every midnight tiptoe, every burden climb with arms full of laundry or grief, it all left something behind. Not marks, not scratches, but shape. The human body moved in patterns, and over time, the home listened. The steps, like pages of a well-read book, had taken the form of the hands that turned them. The dip was shallow but deep in meaning. It spoke of years folded quietly one into another, of decades that blurred at the edges, of small, unnoticed motions that became rituals through nothing more than repetition. And it wasn't just one step. The entire staircase held these echoes, some more subtle, others more pronounced, There were places where heels always struck first. Others were where people turned slightly, out of habit or imbalance. A child learning to walk had tugged on that rail, always in the same spot, until the varnish wore away beneath fingers sticky with jam or ink. To walk those stairs now quietly, with care, was to enter a kind of conversation with the past. One didn't simply go up or down. One followed, as if the steps themselves knew the route and offered it up softly as guidance. A foot might hesitate at the top, only to be reminded where to land by the gentle depression already waiting. That was the beauty of it. The steps had already been taught by those before, and now they taught in turn. There is a dignity in the way objects age when allowed to do so slowly. When nothing is rushed, when there's no need to erase or refinish, time becomes part of the design. These steps had not been replaced, not because no one cared, but perhaps because someone once did. Someone understood that in the quiet curvature of each board was the evidence of a life lived inward, without spectacle. The house was old, but not neglected. It carried its years like folded linen, soft, worn, but carefully kept. The floorboards whispered as you walked. The walls exhaled faint warmth, as though they still held the body heat of people long gone. The windows let in a gentle kind of light, thus catching in it like snowflakes that refused to settle. But it was the steps that held the strongest memory. More than photographs, more than words. They had seen everything, often without being seen themselves. Someone had run up to them in tears, shoes half on, breath caught between sobs. Someone else had come down carefully in the middle of the night, afraid of waking the baby in the room below. Someone had sat on the third step from the bottom, one shoe off, talking quietly to a dog who leaned against their knee. And maybe someone had once stopped halfway up and turned around, just to say one more thing, to apologize, to laugh, to remember what they forgot. The dip in the steps is not just a physical indentation. It's emotional. It's the weight of history borne gently, without bitterness. It's the mark left by the living, not as scars, but as presence. Unlike objects that break or fade or vanish, this kind of wear remains because of care. Because people walk slowly sometimes. Because they didn't rush out the door. Because they carried themselves thoughtfully, over and over, until the wood remembered their way of moving. No one makes steps like that anymore. Modern materials resist wear. Composite wood, manufactured perfectly. Engineered surfaces that remain pristine no matter how many years pass. Stairs now are made to last, but not to age. They're designed to endure traffic, not to tell stories. They do not dip. They do not yield. They do not change shape depending on who moves across them. They remain the same, whether a child skips, a widow climbs, or a stranger pauses. But the old steps, the ones with dips worn by feet you'll never meet, those hold something sacred. They're not trying to impress. They're not polished for guests. They exist in service to the ones who lived in the house, and in doing so, become part of it. There's a quiet intimacy in the idea that the house learned from its people. The doorframe slightly narrowed where a hand always rested. The edge of the stair where a heel always landed. The bottom tread is darker than the rest, from years of pacing while waiting perhaps for news, for someone to come home, or simply because pacing was easier than sitting still. And maybe there was a season when no one climbed the stairs for a while. Illness or absence or grief might have left the house echoing, its steps unused. Dust would have gathered, but even then, the dip remained. Even then, the memory didn't flatten or fade. It waited, patiently. What doesn't forget how it was shaped, not if you let it rest instead of remaking it. People tend to overlook such details. When they think of history, they think of photographs, documents, and heirlooms displayed on mantels. But the true story of a home is often told in its wear, in the spots that gave way, the corners rubbed smooth, the thresholds discolored. A house ages honestly if allowed to, and in doing so, it offers back a kind of warmth that no decor can replicate. In this house, on this staircase, there is no need to ask who lived here. Their presence remains, not in names or portraits, but in softness, dot, and shape. In the way the steps lead you up without protest. In the way you begin, without meaning to place your foot just where someone once did. The dip does not demand, it invites. It says, others walked here before you. You are not alone. Let your step rest in theirs. It's a humble kind of eternity. Nothing grand. Just the steady echo of lives moving upward and downward in quiet cycles. Generations who perhaps never met are now sharing a groove in the woods. Feet of all sizes, all speeds. Some sprinting, some limping, some pausing halfway for breath or memory. All now invisible but not gone. Some would sand the dip away. Refinish the stairs, make them even. Remove the sign of wear in favor of perfection. But perfection does not hold warmth. It does not tell you how to walk. It does not remember how someone used to pause on the 5th step every time they came home, just to listen to the house breathe before continuing up. The dip is not brokenness, it's belonging. Perhaps that's the thing most worth noticing about the stairs, that they don't just carry people, they accompany them. They go up, yes, they come down, but in their quiet way. They wait, they hold, they know how to give just enough without ever giving out. And so, the dip becomes more than a feature. It becomes a testament, not to any one person, but to all of them, to the living done between levels, the lives that move not always forward, but upward, to the small acts that make up the shape of memory, footsteps layered upon footsteps, until the wood gave way not in the feet, but in love. Inside, the steps were worn to a dip, and in that dip were every day that mattered, even the ones no one wrote down, even the ones no one remembered except the stairs, in a shed near the back of a forgotten garden, behind a house that no longer kept the same hours it once did. The old tools waited. They leaned against the walls in rows that time had rearranged. Some were propped carefully where someone had once left them with intention. Others had slouched slowly over the years, finding comfort in the quiet tilts of disuse. Dust softened their edges. Rust blurred their once purposeful surfaces. The air around them smelled of dry wood, old earth, and the echo of labor long since completed. They had not been touched in years, not out of neglect, but out of quiet surrender. The garden had grown wild, not unruly. Ivy curled gently along the outer walls of the shed, as if offering companionship. The once cultivated rows of vegetables had given way to grasses and small flowers no one had planted. The paths had softened under moss. Even the gate creaked differently now, slower, more thoughtful. Inside the shed, time had settled like a second skin. The tools bore it well. There was no bitterness in their waiting, no resentment in the stillness. These were not objects that needed to be used to prove their worth. They knew what they were. A spade with a handle worn smooth by decades of palms. A pair of shears whose blades no longer gleamed, but still met at their pivot with quiet dignity. A rake, a hoe, a trowel will leach bearing traces of the hands that once gripped them, the soil they had turned, the lives they had helped to shape. There was peace in their waiting. They were not discarded. They were not hidden. They were simply resting. Objects of former necessity now resting in the hush of an afternoon that didn't ask for anything more. Cobwebs draped gently from shelves. A watering can stood in the corner, its spout filled with dust instead of water. Nearby, a coil of twine had lost its tension, but not its shape. All of it, the tools, the corners, the shadows had fallen into a rhythm slower than time itself. Sometimes, the door would open. A breeze would wander in, lift a scrap of paper, stir a leaf. Once or twice a bird had found its way inside, fluttered curiously around the rafters, then left again. No one disturbed the tools. People rarely ventured in anymore. The work they once facilitated was no longer required. The house did not rely on a garden for sustenance now. Food came from other places, newer places. The rhythm of life had shifted. And yet, the tools waited, not with anticipation, not in longing, just in readiness. They were not idle, exactly. They were simply paused, held in a kind of perpetual breath. If someone were to walk in, lift one from its resting place, press it again to soil or branch or bark, it would respond. It would remember. The purpose had not been erased, only postponed. Like a line in a poem left unfinished, but still leading somewhere. What's remarkable is how these old tools seem to hold stories, though none of them could speak. A worn notch in a wooden handle whispered of a callus in a hand that held it daily. The way a blade curved ever so slightly off-center hinted at years of favoring one side over the other. Scratches weren't flaws, they were maps. Each mark carried the memory of effort, of season after season returning and retreating, of sun on shoulders and mud under boots. They didn't forget. Above the tools, on a small shelf, sat a row of jars. Some still held nails, others buttons or bits of twine, or seeds in envelopes brown with age. Each jar had once solved a small problem. Each had played a role in days structured by rhythm: planting, watering, harvesting. There had been systems then. A row planted here, another there. But those systems had been gently laid down, like a code at the end of a day. No one announced the stoppage. There was no final dig, no ceremonial last watering. Life simply shifted. The work stopped. The garden became optional and eventually ornamental. The tools were cleaned once, out of habit perhaps, and placed carefully back in the shed. That was all. The pause began and never ended. But still, the tools waited. There is something dignified in objects allowed to age without being replaced. These weren't discarded for newer models, nor put away in bitterness. They were simply allowed to stay. And in staying, they became more than tools. They became evidence, not just of use, but of presence, of a time when someone woke up early to water plants, when the hands worked the oil, when time passed by, the rhythms of the seasons, not the pixels on the screen. Sometimes, a breeze would lift the edge of an old top, or pee and sunlight would spill across the handles. In that light, for a moment, they seemed to come alive again, not with motion, but with memory. They did not shine, but they glowed. The wood seemed warmer, the metal more certain. They had been touched by hundreds of moments, none of which needed to be named. They didn't require documentation. They had simply happened, and that was enough. A child once came into the shed years ago now. She stood just inside the threshold, hesitant, wide-eyed. She didn't know the names of the tools, only that they were old and quiet and somehow important. She reached out, gently, as if afraid they might speak. She picked up a trowel well, turned it over in her hand, and felt its surprising weight. Then she put it back exactly as she had found it. That was all. But even that was remembered in the dust, in the way the tools settled slightly differently afterward. The tools were noticed, not with thought, but with presence. Not everything that waits is forgotten. Some things wait because they remember. And if you stayed long enough in that shed, long enough to let your breathing slow, long enough to let the silence settle around you, you could almost feel it. Not a hum, exactly. Not a sound, but a kind of steadiness, a kind of still, held readiness that asked for nothing and expected even less. It was the kind of patience that had learned not to hope, because hope was too sharp, too bright. Instead, it simply existed, full and slow and steady. The tools didn't miss the days of use. They didn't wish for activity. Tools don't linger in the way people do, but they did hold a kind of stillness that made room for memory. They remembered not by thinking, but by being shaped. The grain of the wood, the chipped edge, the worn leather grip, all of it held the shape of what had been done without needing to repeat it. In that sense, the tools were a kind of history. Not the history found in books or records, but the kind you feel through the weight of something in your hand, through the way a certain handle fits perfectly into your palm, as if it has been waiting for your fingers all along. A history of hands and seasons and the long, slow work of growing. Outside, the garden continued on its terms. Wildflowers bloomed without permission. Vines crept along the old fencing. A tree that had once been trimmed regularly now stretched its limbs freely toward the sky. The natural world did not resent the pause. It welcomed it. It filled the spaces left behind. But inside the shed, the tools remained. They didn't interfere with the outside's wildness. They didn't insist on returning to order. They simply stayed where they were, patient, unused, and full of what they used to be. Sometimes, that's enough to stay, to hold space, to remain what you are, even when your work is no longer needed. The old tools didn't need a purpose anymore. They had already served. What remained was presence, not function. Memory, not motion. And in that stillness, they offered something else, something quieter, but no less important. They offered permission to pause, to age, to be set down and still be whole, to be unused and still be worthy. And so they waited not out of need, not out of fear, but out of patient understanding. Time did not rush them, and they did not rush time. They waited. And in that waiting, they became something more than tools. They became part of the silence, part of the room, part of the gentle world that keeps its kind of memory, even when nothing moves. The tower still stood. It had outlived most of the buildings around it, their bricks having crumbled inward, their doors warped shut by rain and years in forgetfulness. The tower, taller than all the rest, still rose into the air with a kind of quiet dignity. Not defiant, not triumphant, just present. Weathered stone, dulled iron, and moss tracing its edges like soft green handwriting, illegible but insistent. It stood, facing a town that no longer needed it, and yet it faced it all the same. There was a time, long ago, when the tower had purpose, when it meant something. It had been built not for beauty or comfort, but for watching, for signaling, for warning. A fire lit in its uppermost room once meant urgency, danger, alert. Riders would be dispatched, bells rung, torches raised. It was the eye of the town, always open, always alert, always above. Now it watched nothing, not because it no longer knew how, but because there was nothing left to watch for. The town below still existed, of course, in form, in shape. It had not vanished, only changed. Cobblestone streets remained, some neat, others cracked. The houses were smaller now, newer in style but older in spirit. Chimneys still puffed smoke in winter, and someone still hung washing on a crooked line behind the old bakery. Though no bread had been baked there in years, there were signs of life, but the kind of life that no longer looked up. They no longer looked to the tower, not for protection, not for guidance, not even for nostalgia. And the tower, though it could not feel this shift as a human might, sense the silence, the absence, the way echoes no longer returned when it was called with the wind. Once, there had been a sentry, a watchman, a caretaker. The role changed names through the generations, but the idea remained the same. Someone stayed. Someone climbed the narrow spiral stairs and checked the windows, cleaned the soot from the old brass signal mirror, and listened. Sometimes they listened for footsteps, sometimes for hooves, sometimes for sounds that never came. But always, they listened. The last of them left many years ago, not in protest, not in anger, simply because the post was no longer needed. The roads were safe. The hills no longer threatened. No more messengers were galloping toward town bearing urgent news. No more need to light the signal fire at dusk. So the room at the top of the tower sat empty, dust collected in corners, falling in the slowest, gentlest ways. The stone bench by the east-facing window had worn smooth from years of use, but it remained untouched now. Cobwebs spun themselves across narrow windows, catching the light that still filtered in, golden and forgiving, and still. The tower faced the town, not in hope, not in memory, but in habit. It did not mourn its usefulness. It had not been built to feel loss. It was built to endure, and so it endured. It learned the new rhythms of the quiet town not through eyes or ears, but through the subtle shifts of air and shadow. The way children no longer dared each other to climb its base. The way no lanterns were ever hung along its edge during festivals. It was left out of the stories now, as if its age had made it invisible. There were a few who remembered, the older ones, perhaps, a few who had once made the climb to the top, who had squinted at the valley beyond and imagined a world coming toward them. But even their memories softened with time, like parchment left too long in sunlight. What had once been vital became vague. What had once been feared became abstract, and the tower, once the watchful spine of the town, became a relic. But even relics have presence. Even forgotten things cast shadows. In winter, the snow gathered more thickly around its base, undisturbed by feet or shovels. In summer, vines climbed its lower stones, paused halfway up, then turned elsewhere, as if recognizing it offered no warmth, no shelter, no future, yet still it stood, through storm and calm, through laughter and silence. It marked no time. It rang no bells. It simply existed in the landscape, a vertical memory that no one remembered to remember. Inside, the spiral stairs still curved tightly upward, each step worn in the center from centuries of climbing. Dust lay heavy, muffling even the idea of footsteps. A bird had nested in the upper chamber once, finding a hollow near the broken shutter. Its feathers had scattered across the floor. The nest had long since been abandoned, but a few strands of straw remained. No one had swept them away. There were other remnants, too. A rusted lantern, a leather strap nailed to the wall, a mark where someone had once scratched a date into the stone, illegible now, but still there. The space felt paused, not ruined, as if it was still waiting for something it could no longer name. Not hope, exactly, just continuation. Even unused, the tower held itself upright. It watched without need, without reward, because sometimes the act of watching remains, even when no one is watching in return. Down below, the town had shifted its attention. New buildings rose, smaller but more efficient. The old paths toward the tower overgrew with grass and lichen. Children no longer asked about it. Travelers occasionally noticed it from a distance, an old watchtower, they might say, without curiosity. They did not walk toward it. They had places to be. But the tower stayed where it was, facing the town, always facing it. It did not turn toward the hills or the river or the faraway mountains that once threatened its people. Its windows remained aimed at streets and homes and rooftops, at chimneys and laundry lines, at change. It bore witness not to chaos or invasion now, but to neglect, to forgetting, to the gentle way purpose fades not with tragedy, but with time. And yet, there was something peaceful in that, too. The absence of urgency, the stillness of safety, the slow quiet of a town that no longer needed to fear the horizon. Perhaps that was the tower's final purpose, not to guard, but to remember what it had guarded against, to embody vigilance, even when vigilance was no longer required, to remain, so the town could let go. At sunset, its silhouette still caught the light, casting a long shadow that stretched down toward the old main road. No one looked up to see it, but it was there, the shape of memory, the mark of a sentinel still doing its quiet work, even when its watch had ended. The tower faced the town, and the town, without knowing it, still faced the tower. Not with its eyes, perhaps, not with its attention, but with the simple fact of coexistence, with the quiet understanding that some things STA, why so others don't have to. And so the tower stood, patiently doing what it had always done, not asking to be needed, not wishing to be seen, just remaining. Because there is meaning in presence. Some things are left open not out of carelessness, not by accident, but by quiet, deliberate choice. And still, the door remained unlocked as a line that suggests just such an openness. Something is haunting and patient about it. It doesn't announce change or rival, nor does it mourn what's gone. It simply observes a quiet state of readiness, a space that could be entered, but hasn't been, a possibility that lingers untouched. This line doesn't begin the story. It's part 5. After all, something has already happened. Steps have been taken, decisions made, silences endured. We have already passed through the more active phases, perhaps the waiting, perhaps the wondering. And now we reach this moment and resolved, unguarded, quiet. The door is still unlocked. We must first ask, why? Why is the door still unlocked? It might be a habit, or hope, or trust, or even a silent invitation. The kind of gesture that says, I haven't given up, even if I've stopped checking. It could be for someone specific, or no one at all. It could be for memory, for return, for the mere idea of possibility. Or maybe it's not for anyone. Maybe it's just easier to leave it that way than to close it. But more than anything, this unlocked door speaks to a kind of gentle vulnerability in a world so often focused on security, boundaries, and closure. An unlocked door suggests something different. Not weakness, but willingness. Not exposure, but openness. It is the possibility of connection without the demand for it. The readiness to receive without expectation. The door has remained unlocked, which means no one has locked it. No one has come through it, either. And so, it stands not as a passage, but as a symbol of waiting. Not urgent, not desperate, just present. Like a chair left out on the porch. Like a light left on in the hallway. Like a sentence unfinished, not because it was forgotten, but because it was waiting for the right moment to end. This phrase evokes a space suspended in quiet potential. There is no knock, no turning of the handle, no footstep, just stillness. Time passes, and yet the door remains as it was. And in that stillness, we sense a kind of patience that stretches far beyond a single day. It's the patience of someone who no longer paces, who no longer peers out the window, but who still hasn't turned the bolt. It's a deeply human impulse to leave something open, even when we pretend we've moved on, even when we say we've closed the chapter, even when we tell ourselves we don't care anymore. We leave the door unlocked in case the past needs to return, in case the future unexpectedly arrives, in case anyone needs to find their way back in. It is a gesture that holds within it both memory and mercy. And still, the door remained unlocked. This is the kind of line that belongs in a room no one has entered for years. A room dusted with absence. Perhaps a house that hasn't been lived in, but hasn't been abandoned either. There's still a coat on the hook. There's still tea in the cupboard. It's the kind of room someone meant to return to, but never quite did. It's also the kind of space that might exist inside someone's heart. An emotional room left ready, should anyone need to step inside. It might belong to someone who once loved deeply and was left without explanation. Someone who no longer waits by the door, but also hasn't locked it, not yet. Not fully, because locking the door makes a statement. It ends the possibility. It says, you can't come in anymore. Leaving it unlocked, on the other hand, says, you still could. But the door isn't flung open. It's not an invitation in neon lights. It's subtle, quiet, just slightly ajar. Perhaps a softness in the hinges. It's not begging. It's not announcing. It's simply allowing. And that's the beauty of it. The door that remains unlocked is not a demand for entry. It's the silent endurance of a possibility. It may also be a symbol of trust. A door left unlocked in a world full of reasons to close everything off is an act of bravery. It is choosing to remain accessible even after being hurt. It's the decision to stay open even when you know not everyone will knock with kindness, to leave. The door unlocked is to believe that not everything coming your way must be a threat. There's quiet courage in that. I'm not retreating behind walls. You're not fortifying yourself against the world and saying, I am still here. I am still open, even if no one comes. Because being open is not about who arrives. It's about who you are when no one does. And still, the door remained unlocked can also refer to memory. Sometimes, we leave doors unlocked not for people, but for feelings. For moments we don't want to let go of. For dreams we haven't quite admitted or done. For parts of ourselves we've shelved, but not forgotten. That door might lead to a version of you from 10 years ago. A hope you had before the world made you tired. A joy you once carried without condition. We don't lock those doors because we might want to visit them again, quietly, when no one is looking. And so, we keep them accessible, not front and center, but somewhere in the structure of who we are. The door isn't loud, but it's still there. Sometimes, the door stays unlocked simply because no one noticed it. Not through neglect, but because locking it would mean naming something final. And so, we delay. We say, I'll get to it. I'll decide later. I'm not ready to say it's over. I'm not ready to turn that key. And time passes, and still, the door remains unlocked. There's something eternal about this image. as if it has always been that way and might always be. A constant in a world that keeps changing. The world moves fast. People come and go. Names fade from memory, rooms are repainted, and lives are rewritten. But somewhere, there's a door that no one has locked. And that means there's still something that connects the now to the then. Still something that says, not everything is finished. This line also contains a subtle sadness. Because to leave something unlocked is, in part, to acknowledge that no one has walked through it in a long time. You've made it easy. You've made it possible. And yet, no one came. And still, you didn't lock it. There's something quietly heartbreaking about that choice. It's not defeat. It's not even hope, really. It's something softer, more enduring, a kind of loyal melancholy, but also maybe not sad at all, maybe peaceful. Maybe the door is unlocked because you've reached a place where you no longer need to guard everything so tightly, where you no longer need to be afraid of what might walk in or not. The door is unlocked because you are not hiding, because you are ready. For what? You don't know. But readiness itself is enough. It could be that the door isn't even literal. It could be a metaphor for forgiveness. For the kind of forgiveness that doesn't declare itself, doesn't get celebrated, but simply exists quietly. An openness to the past without bitterness. An unlocked door that says, if you ever want to come back not as you were, but as you are, I won't stop you. This line might also belong to a story that never found its ending. A friendship that drifted. A relationship that wasn't quite over, but didn't know how to continue. A dream deferred, but not extinguished. These are not dramatic closures. These are the things we carry in half-light. The half-finished stories we don't know how to let go of. So we don't. We just leave the door open slightly in case the ending wants to arrive late. And still, the door remained unlocked does not offer us an answer. It does not tell us what's on the other side. It doesn't tell us if anyone ever walked through. It just tells us that the option remains. And that alone is powerful. Because so much of life is about options closing, paths narrowing, doors locking. This line pushes gently against that. It says, not all doors close. Some remain quiet, patient, unchanged. The unlocked door becomes a symbol of quiet resistance, a defiance of finality. It tells us that even in a world full of locked gates and closed chapters, something can remain open not loudly, but faithfully, not expectantly, but gently. It says, you don't have to forget. You don't have to let go all at once. You don't have to decide today. You can leave a space. You can leave a light on. You can leave the door unlocked. And in that act, there is hope. Not the sharp, bright hope that demands change, but the slow, steady kind. The kind that says, even if nothing happens, it was worth it to stay open. So if you're standing at the edge of some emotional hallway, unsure what to do next, remember this. You don't always have to close the door to move on. You don't have to lock it just because no one came. You can leave it unlocked, and you can let that be enough.